Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 3, and we'll be dealing with chapter 3 from our textbook, which is all about age and acquisition. Very exciting topic. I find it fascinating, and while it is difficult to find a lot of conclusive research and conclusions that are absolute, it does offer us a lot of information about what we need to consider as instructors, as teachers. So we're going to be looking primarily at second language learning, but so much of what we know about how age affects language learning comes from child first language acquisition, which you learned about in chapter 2. Hopefully you remember that and you can bring that knowledge to this week and build on that, right? Scaffolding. So when you're talking about learning a new language, I'm sure you've heard before about the phenomenal language learning that children can achieve in a second language and how adults are doomed to failure. However, the reality of language learning is quite a bit more, I don't know, nuanced than that. So let's take a look at some of the considerations we need to keep in mind as language teachers and hopefully also language learners, because you can always learn something new. All right. So here's an overview of what we're going to be doing. This chapter discussed some myths about first and second language acquisition. It introduces some key theories and hypotheses about L2 acquisition and age. It considers the cutoff point in terms of age for successful second language learning. It looks at cognitive and affective factors as related to age. And it examines how research in first language, child first language learning can inform second language learning at all stages of our life. Now, I do want to give you a heads up that the last lecture for chapter 1, it was, I think it was around 20-ish minutes, and this one seems to be a bit longer. So also because there's more to talk about. So I am splitting this up into 2 parts. I'm doing part 1 and part 2. And this is primarily to prevent the file from becoming overly large and difficult to download. I had a really tough time with the first one. It took me a few hours to get it just to save to my computer. So, let's try and make this a little bit easier. And also for you, it gives you the chance to sort of view the first half and then view the second half perhaps at a different time if that's better for you. All right, move on. So Brown gave us some common myths about first and second language learning. And so let's talk about them. All right. So myth number 1 is children use repetition. So you're going to do that in second language classrooms. And if you have ever watched children learning a language, especially young children, you know that they repeat things. They'll play with language. They will try a new form or a new word over and over. And so the assumption is, okay, so if that's what's working for you as a child, that's going to work in the second language classroom, regardless of how old you are. All right, second myth is the first language results from imitation. So the second language classroom should also apply this idea. And if anyone has seen or is a parent or is a caretaker of an infant, the first few years of life, the parents are really giving, or the caretakers are giving a lot of input to the child and asking for imitation. How it's famous, say mama, say mama. And you want the kid to say mama or say dada, say dada. So this is imitation. And so the idea is, okay, hey, let's do that in the second language classroom. Number 3, the L1 order of learning should be the same in L2. So the way that things are learned in the first language should, the order should come about the same in the second language learning environment. Number 4, children understand before speaking. And we know this because if you teach children some signs to communicate their needs, they will use those signs before they're actually able to create language and make themselves understood that way. So that should be the same in L2. There should be, they call it the silent period of not having to produce language. So you're just kind of taking it in and you're understanding before you speak. Number 5, in the first language, reading and writing come later. Thus, the same is true for second language. Okay? So, and there is some truth to that. Reading and writing are a little bit, they require a little bit more, especially writing. Writing brings everything together. So we do that comes later for many students in an L2 classroom. Not sure that it's always true though. Number 6, don't translate when you're learning a second language because children don't do it. Now this one's a little crazy because there is no language to translate from when you're doing first language. But there is validity. There is something here for the second language classroom that we'll talk about. And then number 7, there is no need to teach grammar in a first language, so don't do it for a second language. And that's probably not entirely true. All right, some interesting myths here though. All right, so what are we going to do with them? Well, I want you to take a moment and think about which of these myths you agree with. Okay, or which ones do you think there's something valid about them? Has something valid about them. There's no right or wrong answer. I'm not going to quiz you on this, but again, it comes down to what do you believe right now? What do you feel is true? And hopefully you've already read the textbook and the chapter, so you've got some ideas there. But I want you to think about, hey, what do you believe? Do you feel that all of them are 100% false? I can tell you that I don't think all of them are completely wrong, but they are not completely right either, I don't think. Do any of these myths have any merit in considering how children and adults learn language? Okay, and also, what kind of merit do they have? So again, I want you to stop here and reflect on what you think is true at this moment. Okay, from all your experiences, your whole life, from what you've read in the chapter, from what you learned in chapters 1 and 2, especially 2, what do you think is true? You don't have to write anything down, but again, I'm kind of old school. I like to write things down because I forget. So please just pause the slide for, maybe 30 seconds to a minute and just think about, go back to, the previous slide and think about what do you believe? Okay, so hopefully you were able to think a little bit and come up with some interpretations of those myths. I know when I started off teaching ESL, which was a long, long time ago, 1981, I started volunteering with some refugees in our town, Laotian refugees, and had no idea what I was doing. So I was teaching basically the way I had been taught. But I think for me, myths 1, 2, 4, and 7, I felt were really reasonable assumptions, and I probably was teaching using those assumptions, with those assumptions in mind. Now I would have to say that, as with so many things in second language learning, there may be a kernel of truth in these ideas and these myths. However, the absolute adherence to any of them seems quite erroneous. So as with so many things in second language acquisition, there is some truth to them, but again, we're talking about things that are measurable. I don't want to say quantifiable, but it is true. But there is something to that. The important one for me is about translation. Translation's it's a natural step. Some people need to translate, but then you do need to help students to move beyond that, to more natural language. All right, next slide. So we've got these variables. And I know if you remember back in chapter 1, I talked to you about variables, and it continues. There's a dilemma with all these variables. It's difficult. It's difficult to determine the effects of age because you can't really control all the variables. Do you know what I mean by variables? Do you remember? These are the factors that can affect how someone learns a language. The human body and the human brain, they go through incredible changes in the first 20 years or so of a person's life. And that alone is a huge variable. And we go through it at different times and in different ways, and we have different chemistries. And then you need to consider personality, environment, aptitude, and all of that. And is it even valuable to use how children learn their language to inform our understanding of how people learn a second language, especially if we're talking about adults? Are there really parallels? So thus, with all this that's unknown, the researchers are still trying to figure out how age affects language learning in a second language. But so if you look here, we've got like a summary of these ideas. There are some parallels. There are many factors. Um, it's a work in progress. And it's finally, the final point here, this last one here, it's very difficult to isolate language, especially the first language, because it would be unethical to deprive children of language for the sake of research. There are only a couple of examples in the cadre of studies that we use to discuss age and language acquisition. There is a very famous case of a girl named Genie, Genie, where unfortunately her parents were abusive and they kept her locked away in a room until she was about 12, I think 12 or 13 if I remember, and really had very little exposure to language, so she became kind of like a lab rat for some psychologists and linguists. And it's very hard to factor out what sort of social, emotional, and other effects she had from her isolation. But she never achieved a comfortable level of language use. It was always a struggle for her. So, it's impossible to isolate language in an L1 and to see what happens. Okay? All right, move. So one of the big things we've got in SLA is this thing called the critical period hypothesis, CPH, also known as the sensitive period. This has been around for a long time. I think it was first, like in the late 50s, I think is when they came up with the first idea. It actually started in first language acquisition, but it seemed applicable to second language acquisition as well. And recent research has shown that there is some parallel between the two types of learning when you think about the best time for acquisition to occur. There is some accepted idea that puberty is a cutoff for optimal learning, although I've heard there are multiple critical periods. You've got like age 2, maybe age 5, then you've got puberty, then maybe 18 or 20. And it's not an absolute again. So when we're talking about CPH, it's really important for second language acquisition, and we need to look at it in terms of the concepts or the categories of ideas that are important to understanding this. So the first thing we need to talk about are the neurobiological considerations. So let's start with the brain. I have to admit to you, I have my my doctorate in rhetoric and linguistics with a focus on second language acquisition. But if I were to go back to school now for any reason, I would completely, totally pursue a degree in neurolinguistics because brain processes are totally fascinating. And you'll see that I've thrown in a lot because I'm fascinated. Indeed, neurological developments can affect language learning in many ways. So if you have an interest in the brain and learning, I want you to maybe check out this great website. It's called brainresearch.us. And the woman who is who's kind of running this is someone who was a public school teacher, then she was a community college teacher, then she went back and got her degree in I don't know if it's neuropsychology or neurolinguistics, but she has this brain institute and she's got a lot of really good information. So if you go to her website, here, the Brain Research website, and then click on resources, it's a tab at the top of the page, and then click on Brain Info. You're going to see a lot of different sources that you can read if this is interesting to you, that come from all different fields, come from like scientific, very scientific ones. They can come from pop psychology, they come from linguistics, they come from all different areas. And one of the things in this brain, discovery about language and age and all of that is uh, researchers have looked at something called aphasia, which is language difficulty that results as from brain damage. And this is an indicator of how age can affect language learning. They've done a lot of studies that show that the younger someone is when they have when the brain damage occurs, the more likely it is that the brain can compensate for whatever damage has happened in the brain. And the older you get, the less likely it is that the brain can compensate for whatever is lost as a result of that brain damage. So that's pretty interesting. Continuing on with the brain, let's talk about lateralization. Lateralization, that's when the two sides of the brain become specialized and depend more on the corpus callosum for communication. The corpus callosum is this nerve bridge between the two sides. The left hemisphere starts to control more language as lateralization occurs, although there's no majority agreement on this. And like I said, the basis of this is brain damage research. And there's no real agreement when lateralization begins and ends, but we do know it plays a role in second language learning. We're just not sure how much or in what ways exactly this happens. So lateralization is something that's important, but I think the jury's still out and there's still research to be done. And again, it's really hard to do research on language and language in the brain. Okay. All right, next. So they talk about biological timetables, and one of the ways that they've sort of pulled this together is to look at studies about bird songs. All right, and there's a window. It's very clear there's a window of opportunity to learn the identifying bird song for a bird, and it's a little bit cruel. But what they did with these bird studies is they took baby birds and they removed them from their own bird song and then put them back in with their own type of bird. And there was a period in which, if that happened, they could achieve their song, and then a point at which they could not. There was no successful learning of these bird songs. Okay, and I find that very interesting. My brother, one of my brothers, is a ornithologist, or not professional, but he does it for his hobby, and so I find that just fascinating. If you want to read a little bit more, if you're interested, please check out these two articles. I found them. The first one I think is a little more accessible, about explaining this idea of how bird songs are learned by birds, and that idea of a period in which they cannot learn. The second one's a little bit more scientific. It's got a little bit more data in it, method of doing the research, so that might be a little bit denser, but both of them are interesting, and I think you could get a lot from them. Now obviously birds and humans are different, but this gives us evidence of some sort of time limit, right? And that at some point there's a window that closed down, and that I would say is for optimal language learning, not for all language learning, but that there's some point where we stop and it becomes harder to learn language. Okay? All right, so this is the first part of the lecture, and I'm going to end it now and start up with the second part of the lecture. So hopefully you'll be able to listen to the next part, and you'll feel excited to learn more about age and acquisition. All right, see you soon.